The last dirty trick of an aging narcissist, and it fools 95% of empaths. And I want to begin by being honest about both parts of this title before we go anywhere near the content, because both parts deserve examination. The last dirty trick implies something that is specific to aging, specific to a particular stage of the narcissist's life and the narcissist's relationship with their own psychology. And that specificity is real and worth taking seriously, because what happens to the narcissist's construction as the narcissist ages is genuinely different from what happens to it in the earlier decades, and produces genuinely different behavioral expressions that require genuinely different understanding to navigate. And the 95% of empaths implies something about the specific vulnerability of empathically wired people to this particular trick that is also real and also worth taking seriously, because the trick we are going to discuss is specifically calibrated, whether consciously or say, to the exact qualities that make empaths who they are: the deep caring, the accurate perception of genuine suffering, the specific inability to encounter real pain in another person and feel nothing about it. The trick exploits these qualities in a way that is more sophisticated and more specifically targeted than anything the narcissist deployed in the earlier years of the dynamic. And understanding why it is more sophisticated and more specifically targeted requires understanding what aging does to the narcissist construction and why the aging narcissist situation produces the specific trick this episode is going to name. Let's start with what actually happens to the narcissist's construction as the narcissist moves into the later decades of life, because this is the foundation everything else rests on, and because it is a dimension of narcissistic psychology that receives almost no attention in the content that addresses narcissism more broadly. Most conversations about narcissists are implicitly about narcissists in the full functioning of the construction's prime, the period of peak supply availability, peak social visibility, peak practical resources for the supply-seeking behavior, peak physical and social capital for the love bombing and the charm offensive, and the specific presentations that the construction deploys to generate the admiration it requires. The aging narcissist is operating in a fundamentally different context from this peak. The supply availability is declining. The social contexts that were generating the admiration that the construction requires are contracting, retirement removes the professional context, physical changes alter the social capital that the presentation was partly built on, the peer I group reduces, as the people who were providing the ambient supply of the earlier decades become less available. The new supply that the replacement mechanism has always efficiently generated is harder to back-generate when the specific resources the generation depended on are diminishing. And the construction, which has always depended on the continuous flow of supply to keep the actual self, anxiety below the threshold of acute conscious experience, is now operating in a supply-scarce environment for the first time in its functioning. And supply scarcity in a construction that has always operated in supply abundance is not simply a quantitative change. It is a qualitative disruption. The construction was not designed for scarcity. Its mechanisms were calibrated for abundance. And operating in scarcity with mechanisms calibrated for abundance produces a specific kind of strain that the earlier decades of the construction's functioning never required it to manage. Alongside the supply scarcity, aging introduces something to the narcissist's psychological landscape that the construction has been successfully preventing from becoming consciously significant for the entire duration of the narcissist adult life. The specific, unavoidable, not manageable awareness of mortality. Not mortality as an abstract concept, mortality as a felt, present, increasingly specific reality that the body's changes are making impossible to maintain at the comfortable distance from conscious experience that the construction's distraction mechanisms and supply and forward motion were keeping it at during the earlier decades. The aging narcissist construction is encountering something that every construction eventually encounters: the specific limit of what the management mechanisms can manage. They can manage the supply scarcity, partially. They can manage the contracting social contexts, partially. They can manage the declining practical resources, partially. They cannot manage the mortality's felt presence, with the same efficiency, because managing the felt presence of mortality would require either the genuine philosophical and spiritual work that facing mortality honestly demands, work the construction has never undertaken, is not equipped to undertake, or an alternative supply source so powerful and so specifically targeted at the mortality anxiety that it provides the regulatory resource the mortality's felt presence is consuming. And this, the specific supply source powerful enough and specifically targeted enough to provide the regulatory resource the mortality anxiety requires, is where the last dirty trick is born. Because the aging narcissist has discovered, through the specific efficiency of a supply-seeking mechanism that has been running for decades, that there is one supply source available in the aging narcissist landscape that is more powerfully regulatory for the mortality anxiety than anything the ordinary supply-seeking produces. And that supply source is the compassion of the people who love them, specifically the empaths, specifically the people whose accurate perception of genuine suffering and whose genuine, deep, specifically personal caring makes them the most specifically powerful regulatory resource available to a psychology that is, for the first time in its functioning, genuinely frightened. The trick is this. The aging narcissist presents the genuine suffering, not performed suffering. Genuine suffering. The mortality anxiety is real. The supply scarcity is real. The contracting of the life that the construction built is real. The physical changes are real. The awareness of what was done and not done and who was harmed and what was lost is real in the specific, unmanaged, 3 a.m. quality way that we discussed in a previous episode, and in the aging narcissist it is more present, more consistently than the 3 a.m. suggests. Because the management mechanisms are increasingly less resourced and the actual self, contents, are increasingly less suppressible. The suffering the aging narcissist presents is genuine. This is the trick's specific and devastating sophistication. It is not asking the empath to respond to a performance. It is asking the empath to respond to something real. And the empath, whose entire perceptive apparatus is calibrated to detect genuine suffering, and whose entire relational history has been organized around responding to it, cannot detect a deception to resist, because there is no deception to detect. The suffering is real. The vulnerability is real. The apparent openness to the kind of genuine connection that was never available during the relationship's functioning is real in the sense that the supply scarcity and the mortality, anxiety, have reduced the construction's resources to the point where the full maintenance of the presented self is no longer always possible. The gaps in the construction are real gaps. And the empath, perceiving the real suffering and the real vulnerability and the real gaps in construction, responds with the compassion that genuine suffering and genuine vulnerability deserve, which is the compassion the trick was designed to access, not through deception, through the genuine presentation of something real. And the something real, received by the empath's full perceptive and caring apparatus, produces the response that has always been the most specifically powerful regulatory resource available to the narcissist: psychology, the experience of being genuinely cared for in the actual, accurate, seeing and choosing anyway that the actual self has always needed and the construction has always prevented. The aging narcissist has finally found the supply that addresses the mortality anxiety most directly, not the admiration of the construction, the compassion for the actual self. And the empath is the only person whose compassion reaches the actual self with the specific quality the mortality anxiety requires. And accessing that compassion does not require the construction's deception. It requires only the genuine presentation of the actual self's genuine suffering, which is available in the supply-scarce, mortality-present, management-depleted aging narcissist's experience, more continuously and more accessibly than it has ever been at any earlier stage of the construction's functioning. And what the empath does with the genuine suffering when it arrives, and why 95% respond in the way the trick is designed to produce, and what the 5% who do not respond that way understand that the 95% do not. That is exactly where we are going next. What the empath does with the genuine suffering when it arrives is the most important question this episode can ask, and answering it honestly requires holding two things simultaneously that the empaths sate's natural orientation towards suffering makes extremely difficult to hold at the same time. The first thing is that the suffering is real. The second thing is that the suffering being real does not change what responding to it would cost, what responding to it would produce, or whether the relationship that the responding would restore is one that is safe or healthy or genuinely good for the empath to be inside. These two things are not in contradiction. They simply require a quality of simultaneous holding that the empath's receptive and caring apparatus was not designed to make easy, because the empath's natural response to genuine suffering is care, is the movement toward, is the specific, accurate, personally directed compassion that the suffering's genuineness deserves. And the trick exploits this natural response not by deceiving it, the suffering is genuine, the compassion the suffering deserves is genuine, but by using it to access something the non-compassion was not intended to provide. The compassion the empath offers to the aging narcissist's genuine suffering is not received, the way compassion is received by someone who is genuinely open to its implications. It is received as supply, as the most specifically powerful regulatory resource available to the mortality anxiety, as the thing the supply scarce, management depleted, mortality present aging narcissist most urgently needs, and received as supply, however genuine the suffering that accessed it, the compassion does not produce what compassion between two people who are genuinely in relationship with each other produces. It does not produce genuine reciprocity. It does not produce the relationship becoming something different from what it has always been. It produces the regulatory hit, and after the regulatory hit, the construction reasserts to whatever degree the remaining resources allow, and the empath is inside the dynamic again. This is why 95% of empaths are fooled by the last dirty trick. Not because they are naive, not because they cannot perceive what is happening, but because what they are perceiving is genuine. The suffering is real. The vulnerability is real. The gaps in the construction are real. And responding to genuine suffering with compassion is not a flaw in the empath's character. It is the most specific expression of the empath's most genuine quality. The trick does not fool 95% of empaths by deceiving their perception. It fools them by presenting something that their accurate perception correctly identifies as genuine and that their genuine caring correctly responds to, while the context of the presentation, the aging narcissist's supply-seeking mechanism, using the genuine suffering as the most efficiently targeted supply generation strategy available in the current supply-scarce environment, is the thing the compassion prevents them from holding simultaneously with the compassion itself. The compassion and the context cannot both be fully present at the same time in the empath's processing of the situation, because the full presence of the context would require withholding the compassion, and withholding compassion from genuine suffering is something the empath's entire psychological organization makes genuinely difficult. This is not a weakness. It is the specific cost of being someone whose caring is real. And the trick costs the empath something real, precisely because the empath's caring is real. So what does the 5% understand that the 95% does not? And I want to be honest, that the 5% is not a superior category of empath, not more perceptive, not less caring, not somehow less vulnerable to the specific pull of genuine suffering, presented by someone they have genuine history with. The 5% has usually been through something specific that the 95% has not yet been through, something that provided the particular understanding that makes it possible to hold the compassion and the context simultaneously, without the compassion eliminating the context, or the context eliminating the compassion. What the 5% has been through is usually a previous return, a previous experience of responding to the genuine suffering with the genuine compassion and re-entering the dynamic and discovering that the regulatory hit the compassion provided was not the beginning of something different, that the construction's reassertion followed the regulatory hit with the same reliability it always followed everything that preceded it, that the genuine suffering was real, and the genuine compassion was appropriate to the suffering, and the dynamic that the compassion restored was still the dynamic it had always been. The 5% knows this, not from reading about it or from understanding it intellectually, but from having lived it, from having given the compassion and watched what the compassion produced and arrived at the specific, experiential, body-level understanding that genuine suffering in a narcissist and genuine change in a narcissist are two completely different things. That the suffering deserves compassion, and the compassion does not have to mean return. That you can hold the genuine caring for the actual self that the suffering is expressing, without re-entering the relationship that the actual self's construction governs. This distinction between compassion and return, between caring for the person and re-entering the dynamic the person is governed by, is the most important thing the 5% holds that the 95% finds so difficult to hold simultaneously with the compassion. And it is difficult to hold not because it is conceptually complex, but because holding it requires something the empath's natural orientation makes genuinely costly. It requires extending compassion in the direction of the suffering, while simultaneously declining to make the compassion available as supply. Caring without providing the regulatory resource the caring was accessed to provide. Feeling the genuine sadness for what the aging narcissist situation contains, the genuine losses, the genuine contraction of the life the construction built, the genuine mortality anxiety that the management mechanisms can no longer keep below the threshold, and not converting that sadness into the availability that the sadness was designed, through the genuine presentation of genuine suffering, to produce. This is the hardest thing the empath is asked to do in the entire arc of their relationship with the narcissist. Harder than leaving, harder than maintaining no contact through the ordinary hoovering, harder than holding the truly not caring through the supply-seeking return. Because all of those ask the empath to withhold something from a performance. This asks the empath to withhold something from something real. And withholding from something real, when you are someone whose caring is genuinely directed at what is real rather than at the performance, is the specific cost that the last dirty trick is specifically designed to impose. What makes it possible to pay this cost without it requiring the suppression of the compassion that makes you who you are? What makes it possible to feel what the aging narcissist's genuine suffering deserves to be felt, and to not convert the feeling into the return the feeling was pre-accessed to produce, is the understanding that the compassion you extend can be directed at the actual self's suffering without being directed at the construction that governs what any return to the relationship would actually look like. The actual self is genuinely suffering. The actual self deserves the compassion that genuine suffering deserves. And the compassion can be present in you, can be real in you, can be the genuine, accurately directed, specifically personal caring that the empath's nature makes available, without being offered as supply to the mechanism that would use it as such. You can grieve what the aging narcissist situation contains without returning to the situation. You can hold genuine care for the actual self without re-entering the relationship that the actual self's construction governs. You can wish, with complete honesty and complete genuine feeling, that things had been different, that the actual self had had access to what it needed when the relationship could have been something different, without agreeing that the something different is now available simply because the construction's resources are depleted and the actual self is more visible than it used to be. The visibility of the actual self in the aging narcissist is not the same as the availability of the actual self for genuine relationship. The construction is still there, less resourced, more permeable, more frequently interrupted by the actual self's surfacing, but still there, still governing, still producing. When the regulatory hit of the compassion has been received and the anxiety it was addressing has been temporarily reduced, the same dynamic that the compassion was supposed to have changed. The last dirty trick is the most sophisticated thing the narcissist supply-seeking mechanism has ever produced. It is sophisticated because it is honest, because it uses what is genuinely true about the aging narcissist situation to access what is most genuinely true about the empath's nature. And meeting that sophistication requires not the suppression of what is genuinely true about the empath's nature, but its most complete and most carefully directed expression, compassion for the actual self, clarity about the construction, care that does not convert into supply, return that does not follow from feeling. These things together, held simultaneously, with the specific difficulty that holding them simultaneously genuinely requires, are the 5% understanding, and they are available to anyone who has arrived at them through whatever path the arriving requires. The trick is the most sophisticated. The understanding that meets it is the most complete. And the empath who holds both, who feels what the genuine suffering deserves to be felt and does not convert the feeling into the return the feeling was designed to produce, is not less caring than the 95%. They are caring more completely, caring for themselves with the same accuracy and the same genuine attention that they have, always brought to caring for everyone else. And that caring, finally, fully, turned in their own direction, is the most specific and the Bocharan sewer supply-seeking mechanism has ever managed to deploy